There are many misconceptions about Post-Stalin USSR. We will analyze and debunk them all. In this series, we will discuss many topics, such as state of the whole people, peaceful coexistence, the post-Stalin USSR economy, the fall of the USSR, and many more topics. So if you are interested in post-Stalin USSR, be it as a leftist or just a curious person in general, just lay back and enjoy my video. Debunking Misconceptions about Post-Stalin USSR, Episode 5, Nikita Khrushchev's Economic Reforms. Also, before we start this video, I want to quickly mention that we will go in chronological order, or we'll at least try to go in chronological order as much as possible. So we will start with the Sovnarkhoze reforms of 1957 and we'll stop at the pilot scheme reform of 1964. Anyway, so Khrushchev's reforms, many call them revisionist. Many say that they brought back capitalism. Many say that they destroyed central planning, and that's all wrong, and we will debunk all that in this episode today. Anyway, let's start with Nikita Khrushchev's most famous economic reform, which is the 1957 Sovnarkhoze economic reform. Okay, so what was it and what did it do? Okay, so to summarize, the centralized branch management system was replaced with a decentralized geographically distributed system. It was aimed to break the rigidly centralized sectoral management system. It led to the destruction of the unified technical policy and led to the disintegration of economic ties in industry and agriculture. It led to the emergence of intermediate levels of management in the face of the Republican and Union Councils of National Economy and sectoral state committees. Research and design organizations that were under the jurisdiction of the branch management bodies were separated from industrial enterprises, which continued to be subordinate to the territorial authorities. A territorial system replaced the industrial management system. Branch ministries and intersectoral state committees were abolished. The elimination of the contradiction of management of industries on a territorial basis and vertical integration of production in industries happened. Um, the un- the economic reform unified the national economic complex. The economic reform cancelled the departmental subordination of enterprises and gave them to regions. Um, Management was decentralized and the State Commission of the USSR Council of Ministers on Long-Term Planning of the National Economy was transformed into the State Planning Committee of the Council of Ministers of the USSR, and the State Committee of the USSR Council of Ministers on the New Technology was abolished, and State Scientific Technical Committee of the USSR Council of Ministers was established. There was the abolition of 25 of 37 Union and Union Republican ministries of industry and construction, and there was a transfer of enterprises under their control to the direct subordination of the economic regions, aka the Sovnarkhoze. In each economic region, there was a Council of National Economy established with its own branch and functional departments, where the economic management issues were resolved in relation to the economic administrative region, depending on its specialization. Control was given to industrial enterprises, acceleration of the processes of planning, approval, procurement, and construction, etc. happened, and inter-industry cooperation happened. My source is Wikipedia, Russian Wikipedia to be precise. So you may ask me now, So how was this not revisionist? It literally destroyed central planning. Actually, it didn't. Central planning still continued to exist. To quote Alec Nove, the idea was to cope with the problem of ministerial empire building and insufficient coordination by the drastic expedient of abolishing the industrial ministries altogether and substituting a regional structure coordinated by Gosplan. An Economic History of the USSR, 1917 to 1991, by Alec Nove, page 352. What was the Gosplan? The state planning committee that was responsible for central planning. Till the end, the economy was still a centralized planned economy. But didn't management go to the Sovnarkhozy? Yes, indeed, they also managed the economy at the same time. But doesn't this mean that they could do anything they wanted without the state doing anything about it? And doesn't this mean that central planning was thus destroyed? No, they couldn't carry out anything without state approval. To quote Aleknov again. Local coordination and regional planning were impeded by the fact that all enterprises of all Union interests had lines of subordination to Moscow, and too many minor decisions required the assent of remote ministries. An Economic History of the USSR 1917 to 1991 by Alec Nove, page 352. The 1957 Sovnarkhozy economic reforms were basically the same as the economy was under Stalin due to the fact that the economic regions couldn't carry out anything without state approval, and due to the fact that central planning existed both on paper and in practice. Anyway, now I know that I said that we will go in chronological order as much as possible in this video, but let's actually talk about the Virgin Lands campaign now. I know that it's not an economic reform, but I have to mention it. And look, I started talking about the 1957 Sovnarkhozy reforms. First, to have a positive start, like I didn't want to start negatively, okay? So from now on, we will truly go in chronological order, okay? First, we will talk about the reasons for why the Virgin Lands campaign happened. So, to quote an article, the decision to start the corn project was approved in January 1955 by the plenum of the Central Committee of the CPSU, at which Khrushchev made a report on increasing the production of livestock products. On it, referring to the successful American experience, he announced the need to increase the area of arable land allocated for corn by an order of magnitude. Practice shows that wherever wheat is cultivated, corn can reach a milky, waxy ripeness or ripeness. I don't know how to pronounce this. He argued to the party. We are obliged to provide We are obliged to provide new areas of corn cultivation with seeds grown in the south this year as well as in the following year. Basically, Khrushchev wanted agricultural output to increase, and he thought that agricultural output would only increase if the USSR will build corn everywhere. So this is Khrushchev's theory, and this is not it. To quote this article again, Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev was right. It is not necessary, of course, to sow the whole country with corn, but this growing corn is much more productive and useful and increases the productivity of meat and dairy farming, the head of the Ministry of Agriculture said in early October. So, as you can see, Khrushchev said that corn is more productive and more useful and increases the productivity of meat and dairy farming more. This is partially why the vigilance campaign happened as well, and there is one more reason. To quote this article one last time. I am a corn farmer, he used to joke when talking to party members and recalling how in 1949, when he was the first secretary of the Communist Party of the Ukrainian SSR, he managed to save the Soviet Republic, entrusted to him from starvation thanks to corn. Already at the February-March plenum of the Central Committee of the CPSU in 1954, he first raised the issue of the need for a large-scale distribution of corn crops. By this time, the regional press was already in full swing to was already in full swing campaign in support of this initiative. The production of corn, Khrushchev assured, should have solved two problems of the Soviet agricultural industry at once: a shortage of grain and a shortage of feed for livestock. As we can see, Khrushchev saved Ukraine from starvation thanks to corn, and this is partially why he wanted to feed the entire USSR with corn and make corn the second bread. Yeah, it worked in his own little republic, but it didn't work all over the USSR. Okay, so let's now talk about the reforms of 1956. There were three reforms in 1956. Let's start with the wage reform of 1956. What were the wage reforms of 1956? Here is a short summary. 1. Basic wages were to be raised so that they represented a higher share of earnings. 2. Norms were to be raised to limit their overfulfillment. Overfulfillment. 3. The number of wage scales and wage rates within each scale were to be sharply reduced and simplified with the aim of eliminating the patchwork of scales and skill grades. 4. Progressive piece rates were to be eliminated. 5. With the emphasis on norm or fulfillment, payments and the attempt to control the arbitrary and often capricious award of bonuses to time workers. New bonus regulations were introduced to reward workers for meeting various production and quality indicators. 6. Various groups of piece workers whose jobs were now deemed incompatible with piecework, who those carrying out maintenance and repair of equipment, for example, were to be shifted on time wage. Basically, now we will go through what this reform was. Basically, I will oversimplify it. I'm going to tell you it in a more simplistic way. So basically, it increased income, increased payment, it increased wages as in income and payment, and norms were raised. That means that, for example, you had to produce now one car in 2 hours instead of in 4 hours. You know what I mean? You have to work more now. And yeah, the patchwork of scales and skill grades was eliminated. What was the patchwork of scales and skill grades? How did this reform change this? Well, the rates increased, meaning that the minimum wages increased for jobs. We will talk about minimum wages more later. Wage scales were also narrowed. Under Stalin, a worker who worked at the same job longer than someone else received higher payment. This continued despite the wage reform, but was still narrowed. The piecework system from the Stalin era, which Marx and Engels condemned, was also decreased, meaning that some jobs were worked on time wages now, meaning that the workers in these particular jobs weren't paid anymore according to how much products they produced, but according to how long they worked while producing as many products as are demanded. According to this Wikipedia article here, 25% of workers before the wage reform in 1956 worked in a time wage system, meaning that this system already to a large extent existed under Stalin. In 1962, however, 40% of workers under worked under a time wage system. To quote Marx and Engels, to show that they condemned the piecework system and supported the time wage system instead. Piecework has therefore a tendency, while raising individual wages above the average, to lower this average itself. But where a particular rate of piece wage has for a long time been fixed by tradition, and its lowering therefore presented as special difficulties, the masters in such exceptional cases sometimes had recourse to its compulsory transformation into time wages. Hence, for example, in 1860, a great strike among the ribbon weavers of Coventry. Piece wage is finally one of the chief supporters of the hour system described in the preceding chapter. Marx, Das Kapital, Volume 120, Chapter 21. From what has been shown so far, it follows that piece wage is the form of wages most in harmony with the capital's mode of production. Karl Marx, Das Kapital, Volume 1, Chapter 21. Anyway, the piecework system still existed. It was only abolished for a few particular jobs. Anyway, revolts were part of this reform, since revolts are more associated with the Kosygin reforms and Brezhnev. I will talk about them in episode 6 of my Post-Stalin USSR series. Anyway, let me talk about the next economic reform of Nikita Khrushchev, which also happened in 1956. I'm talking about the inequality reform. Let me read out an article about it. For almost 30 years, beginning in 1931, every major statement of Soviet wage policy was accompanied by a denunciation of equalitarianism. Some scholars, apparently uninhibited by the paucity of data, concluded that income inequality in Soviet Russia far exceeded anything existing in the Western world. So, as we can see, inequality under Stalin was supported, and it was worse than in America and the West. And okay, so what did Khrushchev do? Let's read. The situation has changed markedly since 1956 in several important respects, beginning with the 20th Congress in 1956 and culminating with the program adopted by the 22nd Congress in 1961. The main emphasis in Soviet wage policy has been placed on a narrowing of the income gap between high and low paid personnel. The theme was first enunciated by Mikoyan at the 20th Congress. It was implemented at the 21st Congress in 1959, at which time a program of increasing minimum wages from their prevailing level of 27 to 35 rubles to 50 to 60 rubles per month by 1965 was announced, and it was reasserted at the 22nd Congress, where it was declared in the program that in the next 20 years the disparity between high and comparatively low incomes must be steadily reduced. Okay, so basically, minimum wages increased. The most low paid personnel weren't paid that low anymore, and the highest paid personnel weren't paid that high anymore. And also, to compare the Soviet Union and America, so I'm just going to give you the earliest data that I have from Post-Stalin USSR. So here, as you can see, it was pretty much the same. The last economic reform of 1956 that I want to talk about was Khrushchev's abolition of cooperatives and the abolition of small market and small private leftovers from the Stalin era. To quote a few sources, Khrushchev had fully nationalized the producers' cooperatives. Historian Moshe Levin, The Soviet Century, page 249. On April 14, 1956, there was a resolution of the Central Committee of the CPSU and the Council of Ministers of the USSR on the reorganization of commercial cooperatives, according to which the RTL enterprises were transferred to the state. Okay, now you may ask me now, why did Khrushchev abolish cooperatives? Let me tell you why. To quote an article, despite the war, in a number of sectors, market relations have become entrenched. They have already been uprooted by Khrushchev. They interfered with the formalized class of the party farm nomenclature. As you can see, yeah, they pretty much just interfered with the nomenclature, and yeah. Okay, so you may ask me now, were there any exceptions? Yes, they were. What were they? Let me quote an article. This state of affairs this state of affairs continued until 1956, when Nikita Khrushchev officially banned and within a few years disbanded all consumer cooperatives. Khrushchev decided to completely transfer all RTL enterprises to the state by 1960. The only exceptions were small-scale consumer services, arts and crafts, and handicapped artels. Moreover, they were forbidden to carry out regular retail trade in their products. The false assumption that Khrushchev is a market reformer is nothing but a liberal myth created by liberals because they like Khrushchev for the secret speech. Anyway, the next reform that I want to talk about are the 1957 Sovkhozy reforms. Khrushchev wanted to turn the kolkhozes into sovkhozy, meaning that he wanted to nationalize them. He wanted to do this because he thought that this will be more efficient. To quote a Wikipedia article, from 1954 onwards, the tendency to transform collective farms into state farms has gained strength. The Council of Ministers of the USSR and the Central Committee of the CPSU consider it necessary, in connection with the wish of the collective farmers, to change the existing procedure for transferring collective farm property when converting collective farms into state farms. Anyway, Khrushchev sooner or later wanted to transform all the collective farms into nationalized farms, okay? Also, they existed under Stalin as well. So this is not revisionist, okay? Anyway, I also quoted a document from the Soviet archives, that document said that Khrushchev and the CPSU believed that all the collective farmers which wanted their farms to nationalize had to be nationalized. So a lot of collective farms were nationalized. Anyway, the next economic reform that we will talk about is the abolition of the MTS, which happened in 1958. Let's firstly talk about why the MTS got abolished. Khrushchev personally believed that the MTS were inefficient, and that's not the only reason. He also believed that they had fulfilled their purpose, and the kolkhozes, the peasants, hated the MTS. So that was the thing that mostly contributed to Khrushchev wanting to abolish the MTS. Anyway, to quote a book a few times. The antagonism between the kolkhoz chairman and the MTS was brought home with particular forcefulness to the leaders of the party in the summer of 1956. In July, following a special session of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR devoted to a new pension law, Benediktov called a meeting of those deputies who were kolkhoz chairmen to sound out their opinions and suggestions on current agricultural matters. Benediktov was allegedly much taken aback when at the very beginning of the discussion the assembled chairman had shouted in chorus, "We have had enough of the MTS. This incident may well have been a turning point in the attitude of the party leaders, particularly Khrushchev, toward the MTS and the entire future course of agricultural development. 100,000 tractors, the MTS and the development of controls in Soviet agriculture by Robert F. Miller, page 314. There are two bosses on one plot of land, the kolkhozes and the MTS, and when there are two bosses there cannot be good order. In a modern farm everything depends on the work of the tractor and the combine, yet the kolkhoz has to agree upon and coordinate even such matters as where to put a tractor. All this leads to an irrational use of technology and brings harm to the interests of the state in the kolkhozes. He concluded by asking, is it not better to sell the machines to the kolkhozes and let them use the technology themselves in the interest of the economy? 100,000 tractors, the MTS and the development of controls in the Soviet agriculture by Robert F. Miller, pages 325 to 326. The kolkhozes, aka the peasants and the representatives, hated the MTS because they were competing against each other and because the kolkhozes weren't in control over tractors and other technology. The MTS were and commanded everything in terms of technology and put peasants into debt. The peasants were completely dependent on the state and the MTS. To quote an article, we must not forget that MTS was a specific tool of the state's policy towards the peasantry. They made the peasantry completely dependent on the state, and the natural supply of products for the work performed by MTS was at that time a guarantee of receiving certain amounts of food to state funds at low prices. But the argument, the sale of machinery will ruin the collective farms, stands clearly apart from these circumstances. Also, Stalin also wanted to abolish the MTS, or at least wanted to change the way they function and change them. To quote this article again, we do not have Wenger's letters directly, and judging by the arguments that Stalin criticized, Wenger and Sanina in their letters proceeded primarily from the fact that collective farms are independent cooperatives that already have certain ownership of the means of production, small inventory, livestock, and material working capital, and are economically able to acquire equipment, freeing the state from these investments. Stalin also argued that agricultural machinery should be systematically updated, and that this is an expensive measure that pays off only in 6 to 8 years. So, what were the MTS replaced by? The RTS. What the RTS were and how they were different from the MTS is what I will discuss now. To quote the same article again, it is also very significant that MTS were transformed into repair and technical service stations that were supposed to carry out repairs and maintenance of equipment supplied to farms, introduce advanced technologies in crop production and animal husbandry, carry out reclamation, road planning, and other works that require a large number of special treatment, etc. In other words, all the accumulated and necessary potential of MTS for further development of agriculture was preserved and received new forms of implementation. From RTS later grew the system of agricultural machinery. Firstly, the MTS was not Firstly, the MTS equipment was not given to the collective farms or sold in installments at the residual value. They were forced to buy equipment at fairly high prices in a short time, within a year until March 1959. In total, the collective farms had to pay 16.6 billion rubles for the purchase cost. Since not everyone was able to pay on time, the calculations were extended for another year. At the same time, RTS, state-owned enterprises, began to dictate their prices for the repair of collective farm equipment. In a nutshell, RTS and MTS were both state-owned, but the RTS served the kolkhozes, whereas the MTS kept the things that they sold to kolkhozes and had to negotiate a lot and put kolkhozes on debt. Did this reform make the Soviet Union decollectivized? No, to quote this article one last time. Also, just so you know, I don't even know why I'm answering this question because tractors and agricultural technology have almost nothing to do with collectivized farming, but anyway, here. Did they carry out all reproduction by counting the proceeds from the products produced and sold delivered, or did the state make a significant part of the investment? In fact, up to 40 to 50% of capex, that's how I think it's pronounced, in agriculture, including for collective farms, was financed by the state. Could the state allow this or that collective farm to remain completely without working capital and means of payment of labor in some form? In cases of losses, did the collective farm stop production or were these losses periodically written off? Is there at least one case when a collective farm actually went bankrupt, left without the support of the state? And if the collective farms were ruined by the sale of machinery, shouldn't this have led to major reductions in agricultural production in the country? The very formulation of these questions and the minimal familiarization with the state of production of collective farms in 1958 to 1965 show that there could not have been and was not any destruction of the kolkhozes. Okay, so the next economic reform, which isn't really an economic reform that I want to talk about, is communism in 20 years. This reform and the communism in one country are actually Stalin's ideas, to quote Stalin. Alexander Werf asks, do you believe that with the further progress of the Soviet Union towards communism, the possibilities of peaceful cooperation with the outside world will not decrease as far as the Soviet Union is concerned? Is communism in one country possible? Stalin answers, I do not doubt that the possibilities of peaceful cooperation, far from decreasing, may even grow. Communism in one country is perfectly possible, especially in a country like the Soviet Union. Source interview with Alexander Werf, September 24th, 1946. The last economic reform that I want to talk about is the re-centralization of 1962 to 1964, which started the gradual abolishment of the Sovnarkhozy. So, what changes did the re-centralization of 1962 to 1964 cause? Let's read Aleknov for that. 1. A long list of state committees was created which by 1962 had very much the same designations as the defunct ministries, but they had no executive authority. Enterprises were not subordinate to them. They advised, especially on investment and technical policy. They could not order. 2. Gosplan was again split. At all union level perspective, planning and research were made the responsibility of an economic science council, Gosekonomsovet, in 1960. Then, in November 1962, Khrushchev announced another change. Gosplan would plan, particularly in the longer term, while a new body, the All-Union Sovnarkhoz, would implement plans. There emerged in February 1963 a super coordinator of the coordinators, which was given the historically memorable name of VSNKH, but which seems to have achieved little in its short life. 3. Sovnarkhozy were merged, reduced in number from over 100 to 47 early in 1963. The four Central Asian republics were made into one Sovnarkhoz, and a Russian was appointed to head it. Other changes included the creation of large planning regions, 17 for the whole country, which achieved little in practice. 4. The party itself was split in 1962 into industrial and agricultural sections, which caused much perplexity, so that the fact that the enlargements of Narkozes seldom coincided with the geographical divisions of the party. So, on the one hand, each half of the divided part was enjoined to supervise the economic activities within its jurisdiction, but on the other, it was made organizationally difficult to do this. Khrushchev seems to have feared party officials' collusion in localism. Source: An Economic History of the USSR, 1917 to 1991 by Aleknov, pages 369 to 370.
To summarize, the recentralization of 1962 to 1964, it brought back the defunct ministries which we talked about early in the Sovnarkhoz section of this video, but they could not comment when they were brought back though. They could only advise. The Gosplan was also split, but essentially it functioned the same way as it did before. One section of the Gosplan just got a separate name and only received and implemented plans. There was also the Supreme Soviet of the National Economy brought back, which double-checked what the coordinators were doing. The Sovnarkhoz decreased, made a part of the party responsible for agriculture and the other half for industry. All this started the slow and gradual abolishment of the Sovnarkhoz, which could have ended completely in around 1968 if Khrushchev would have stayed in power. Keep in mind that the vast majority of Khrushchev's and Brezhnev's economic reforms were experiments. The successful ones were kept, the failed ones were abolished. Also, before I end this video, I want to say that there were 3 or I guess 2 more economic reforms under Khrushchev. There was the 7-year plan, which included a very soft version of the Kosygin reforms of 1965, and there were also the Lieberman reforms of 1964, one of which is known as the pilot scheme if I'm not mistaken, which is basically the exact same as the Kosygin reforms of 1965. And the same goes for the other Lieberman reform of 1964, though I won't cover them in this episode as the Lieberman-Kosygin reforms are more associated with Brezhnev's, so I will cover them in episode 6 of my Post-Stalin USSR series. In conclusion, Khrushchev did not destroy central planning, and he didn't destroy collectivized farming either. He didn't restore capitalism. He pretty much changed nothing and was in many ways an extremist more left-wing than Stalin. For example, he abolished all small cooperatives, which are small market leftovers from the Stalin era. A lot of Khrushchev stuff, such as communism in 20 years, also started under Stalin, and the Khan campaign wasn't actually that bad. Also, I'd like to give credits to a guy called Gloomy who helped me do research on the Khan campaign. He has a Discord server that I'll put in the description. Okay, thank you for watching this video. Please share, like, and subscribe if you enjoyed. Goodbye.